The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the bustling parking lot of Westview Mall. Among the rows of cars, Rachel Carter carefully packed her truck with tools from her latest fire safety inspection. She had spent the day ensuring businesses in the mall met safety regulations, a job she took pride in. Rachel was a woman who believed in doing things by the book, her calm demeanor often serving as a shield against the world's unexpected challenges. But today was about to test her resolve like never before. As she secured the last piece of equipment in her truck, Rachel noticed a man approaching. His presence was impossible to ignore. His crisp uniform, the stern look on his face, and the unmistakable authority of a police officer. At first, she thought nothing of it. Perhaps he was patrolling the lot, a common enough sight. But as he came closer, the tension in his stride became more apparent. "Man," the officer called out, his voice sharp and clipped. Rachel turned, offering a polite smile. "Yes, officer. Can I help you with something?" she asked, her tone warm but cautious. The man stopped a few feet away, his gaze cold and piercing. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area," he said. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" Rachel furrowed her brow. "I'm finishing up an inspection," she explained, gesturing to the truck. "I work for Metro Fire Safety Consultants. Here's my ID." She reached into her pocket to retrieve her identification, but before she could present it, the officer's tone grew sharper. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he barked, stepping closer. Rachel froze, her hands instinctively raised to shoulder level. "I'm just getting my ID," she said evenly, though her heart was beginning to race. The officer's eyes narrowed as he scanned her truck, his posture radiating suspicion. "Industrial equipment, huh? Seems like a convenient excuse," he muttered under his breath. Rachel caught the words, her stomach tightening. "I assure you, officer, everything here is legitimate. If you'd like, I can show you the inspection paperwork," she offered, her voice steady but firm. Instead of responding, the officer took a step closer, his hand resting on the baton strapped to his belt. "You don't seem to understand the seriousness of this situation," he said, his tone laced with condescension. "You're on private property. I need you to cooperate fully." Rachel took a deep breath, sensing the shift in the air. This wasn't a routine check. There was something else driving his behavior, something darker. She glanced around the lot, noting the absence of any bystanders. It was just the two of them, and that realization sent a shiver down her spine. "I'm happy to cooperate," she said, keeping her voice calm. "But I need to know what I'm being accused of." The officer's jaw tightened. "Accused?" he echoed, his voice rising. "I ask the questions here, not you." Before Rachel could respond, the officer pulled out his baton, pointing it toward her in a threatening gesture. "Step away from the vehicle," he ordered. Rachel hesitated. "Officer, this isn't necessary." "I'm not resisting," she said, her voice steady but firm. But the man wasn't listening. His face was twisted with an anger that seemed disproportionate to the situation. Rachel's instincts screamed at her to tread carefully. "Step away," he repeated, his voice booming. Rachel complied, taking a few steps back. She could feel her pulse quicken as the situation escalated. "I don't want any trouble," she said softly. "Trouble?" The officer laughed, but it was a cold, humorless sound. "You've already caused plenty of that." As he raised the baton higher, Rachel's mind raced. She wasn't sure what he intended to do, but she knew she had to act. This wasn't just about her safety. It was about standing her ground against someone abusing their authority. Suddenly, another voice cut through the tension. "Hey, what's going on here?" Rachel turned to see a mall security guard approaching, his phone held out, already recording the encounter. Relief washed over her, but it was fleeting. The officer's face contorted with rage at the intrusion. "This is police business," he snapped at the guard. "Step back." The guard didn't flinch. "It doesn't look like police business to me," he said firmly. "I'm recording everything. Backup's on the way." For a moment, Rachel saw the officer hesitate. His grip on the baton tightened, but his eyes darted toward the guard's phone. The presence of a witness, of irrefutable evidence had shaken him. Rachel seized the opportunity. "Officer, you're making a mistake," she said, her voice stronger now. "This won't end well for you." But instead of backing down, the officer's fury seemed to ignite anew. His gaze flicked between Rachel and the guard, his pride and authority hanging by a thread. Then, without warning, he reached for the pepper spray on his belt. The next moments unfolded in a blur. Rachel's instincts took over as she dodged the first spray, coughing as the chemical cloud stung her eyes and throat. She stumbled behind a parked car, using the vehicle as a barrier. "Stay down!" the officer shouted, advancing toward her. "Get back!" the guard yelled, his voice rising in panic. "This is all on video." But the officer was beyond reason, his actions driven by rage and desperation. Rachel, her vision blurred and lungs burning, felt her hand brush against something solid, a fire extinguisher. She gripped it tightly, her mind racing. She didn't want to escalate the situation further, but she also couldn't stand idly by as this man abused his power. The sound of sirens in the distance broke through the chaos, a faint but unmistakable signal of approaching help. Rachel's breath hitched. She just needed to hold on a little longer. The officer froze, the sirens piercing through his haze of rage. For the first time, doubt flickered across his face. Rachel, still clutching the fire extinguisher, met his gaze with unwavering resolve. "Your actions have consequences," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. The sirens grew louder, the flashing lights drawing closer. Rachel's heart pounded as she realized the moment of reckoning was near. But what would happen next? Would justice prevail, or would this man's unchecked anger lead to even greater harm? The story was far from over, and the truth had yet to fully emerge. The piercing wail of the sirens cut through the tense air, growing louder with every passing second. Rachel's grip on the fire extinguisher tightened as her chest heaved, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She was cornered, caught between the searing fear of what the enraged officer might do next and the flickering hope that help was just moments away. The officer, too, had paused, his posture stiffening as the realization set in. Backup was coming, and his reckless behavior was no longer hidden in the shadows. His eyes darted to the mall security guard, whose phone remained unwaveringly aimed in his direction. The guard's face was stern, his stance unyielding as he silently recorded every second of the encounter. Rachel swallowed hard, her throat still burning from the pepper spray lingering in the air. The adrenaline coursing through her veins sharpened her focus, and her thoughts raced. Who was this officer, and why was he acting this way? None of it made sense. She had done nothing wrong, nothing to warrant this level of aggression. As the sirens drew closer, the officer took a step back, his demeanor shifting from fury to something closer to panic. It was subtle, but Rachel could see it. His jaw clenched, his gaze flickering between Rachel, the guard, and the approaching police cars. "I don't need this interference," he muttered under his breath, though his voice carried enough to be heard. The security guard didn't budge. Interference. "You're the one who escalated this situation. You have no right to treat her like this," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension. Rachel's eyes locked onto the officer, her mind racing with a mixture of defiance and fear. She couldn't let this moment pass without holding him accountable, but she also knew how dangerous the situation still was. The wrong move, the wrong word, and it could all spiral out of control again. The blinding blue and red lights of the approaching squad cars finally came into view. Rachel felt a wave of relief, though her heart continued to pound. This wasn't over yet. The first patrol car screeched to a stop just a few yards away. Two officers quickly stepped out, their hands resting cautiously on their belts as they assessed the scene. Rachel saw their eyes widen slightly as they took in the disheveled officer, the guard with his phone, and her, standing behind the truck, clutching a fire extinguisher like her life depended on it. "What's going on here?" one of the arriving officers demanded, his voice steady but firm. The officer who had been tormenting Rachel straightened his posture, attempting to regain his composure. "Routine stop," he said gruffly. The suspect was acting suspiciously near her vehicle. "I took necessary precautions." Suspect. Rachel's voice cracked as she stepped forward, unable to contain her disbelief. I'm not a suspect. I was just loading my equipment after an inspection job. He attacked me for no reason. The security guard chimed in immediately, holding up his phone. I've got it all on video. She's telling the truth. This officer came at her without cause. He used pepper spray, for crying out loud. The newly arrived officers exchanged looks, their expressions growing more serious. One of them turned to Rachel. Ma'am, are you okay? Do you need medical attention? Rachel shook her head. I'll be fine, she said, though her voice wavered. But this isn't right. He threatened me, accused me of things I didn't do. The officer who had caused the chaos bristled. I was doing my job, he snapped. She refused to cooperate. She posed a threat. A threat? Rachel echoed, her voice rising in disbelief. I was standing by my truck with a clipboard and paperwork. How is that a threat? The tension between them was palpable, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. One of the newly arrived officers held up a hand, his tone firm but measured. All right, everyone needs to calm down. We'll sort this out, but we're going to need statements from all parties involved. The officer who had instigated the situation hesitated, his face a mix of frustration and unease. He glanced at the security guard's phone, clearly aware that the recording could dismantle whatever version of events he was trying to construct. Rachel, still clutching the fire extinguisher, stepped back and leaned against the side of her truck. She felt the weight of the moment sinking in, the realization that this was far from over. Her mind replayed the events leading up to this confrontation, searching for any clue that could explain why she had been targeted. The officers began taking statements, starting with the security guard, whose recounting of the events was straightforward and unwavering. As he spoke, Rachel noticed the way the officer who had attacked her shifted uncomfortably, his confidence visibly cracking. When it was Rachel's turn, she took a deep breath and recounted everything. Her work at the mall, the officer's initial approach, his escalating aggression, and the terrifying moments where she thought he might truly hurt her. She kept her voice steady, but the emotions beneath the surface threatened to break through. I don't know why he singled me out, she said finally, her voice soft but resolute. But I know this wasn't right. I've never experienced anything like this before. As the officers listened, their expressions grew darker. It was clear that they understood the gravity of the situation, though they refrained from making any immediate judgments. The officer who had caused the chaos stood silently to the side, his jaw clenched as the statements continued. Rachel noticed the way his hands fidgeted at his sides, a stark contrast to his earlier aggression. It was as if he was realizing too late that his actions had consequences. When the officers finally turned to him for his version of events, his tone was defensive. She was acting suspiciously. I had to act. That's what we're trained to do. And pepper spray? One of the officers pressed, his tone skeptical. Was that necessary in this situation? The man's response was evasive, his confidence faltering. Rachel watched as the cracks in his facade became more apparent. For the first time since the ordeal began, she felt a glimmer of hope that the truth might come to light. But even as the officers continued their investigation, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about one officer's bad judgment. There was something deeper at play, something that went beyond the parking lot of the Westview Mall. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the lot, Rachel realized that this moment was a turning point, not just for her, but for everyone involved. The question was, what would come next? The air around the parking lot seemed heavier now, as if the weight of the confrontation had settled into the pavement itself. Rachel stood by her truck, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she tried to steady her breathing. Her mind felt like a whirlwind, spinning with confusion, anger, and exhaustion. She glanced at the security guard, who gave her a small, reassuring nod. For a stranger, his support felt like the only thing holding her together in that moment. The officers who had just arrived were now speaking in hushed tones near their patrol cars, their faces a mix of concern and calculation. Occasionally, one of them would glance in Rachel's direction, then back at the officer who had instigated everything. His name tag read Officer Reynolds, but Rachel couldn't bring herself to call him by name. To her, he was a symbol of everything she feared might happen one day, but hoped never would. A new patrol car pulled up to the scene, and out stepped a woman in her mid-40s, her uniform crisp and her demeanor commanding. She had an air of authority that made everyone stand a little straighter. Her badge identified her as Sergeant Carter, and Rachel couldn't help but feel a small spark of relief. Maybe she finally gets someone to take this seriously. Sergeant Carter walked up to Rachel first, her tone professional, but not unkind. "Miss, Rachel, is it? I've been briefed on what's happened so far. Are you okay to talk with me?" Rachel nodded. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice betrayed how rattled she still felt. "But I need someone to listen. Really listen." Sergeant Carter gave her a firm nod. "That's what I'm here for. Let's take it one step at a time." She gestured to a quieter spot near the edge of the lot, away from the tension still brewing between the other officers. Rachel followed, her legs feeling unsteady, but determined to keep moving forward. As Rachel recounted the events yet again, she noticed how carefully Sergeant Carter listened, her expression remaining neutral, but her eyes sharp. It felt different from the others, like she was actively piecing the puzzle together, not just going through the motions. "I appreciate you being so detailed," Carter said when Rachel finished. "It's important we have all perspectives. And I've already been informed that there's video evidence from the security guard." Rachel nodded, her grip tightening on the edge of the truck. "Do you believe me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Carter hesitated for a moment, then met Rachel's gaze directly. "What I believe isn't the priority right now. What matters is getting to the truth. And from what I've seen so far, it doesn't look good for Officer Reynolds." Meanwhile, across the lot, Reynolds stood with his arms crossed, visibly tense as the other officers questioned him. His words were clipped, his tone defensive. He seemed to be sticking to his version of events, painting Rachel as a suspicious individual who had failed to comply. But the cracks in his story were becoming more apparent, especially with the presence of the video evidence. The security guard, who had continued filming even after the other officers arrived, quietly approached Rachel and Sergeant Carter. "I think you'll want to see this," he said, holding out his phone. "It's all here," from the moment he walked up to her truck. He didn't even try to de-escalate, just went straight for intimidation. Carter reviewed the footage carefully, her face unreadable. Rachel watched her reaction closely, hoping to catch a glimpse of validation, some confirmation that she wasn't overreacting. When Carter finally looked up, her expression was grave. "This changes things," Carter said simply. She turned to the security guard. "I'll need you to send this to our department immediately. This will be critical for our investigation." The guard nodded. "Already done," he said. "I wasn't about to let this slide." As Carter moved to address the other officers, Rachel found herself leaning against her truck, her legs feeling like jelly. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving her physically and emotionally drained. The security guard stayed nearby, offering quiet support. "You okay?" he asked after a moment. "I don't know," Rachel admitted. "I want to believe this will be handled the right way, but what if it's not? What if he gets away with it?" The guard's expression softened. "I can't promise anything," he said honestly. "But you've done everything you could. You stood your ground, and now there's evidence to back you up. That counts for something." Nearby, Sergeant Carter was now speaking with Reynolds, her voice firm but controlled. It was clear from her tone that she wasn't buying his excuses, but Reynolds wasn't backing down easily. His posture was rigid, his words laced with frustration. "This is ridiculous," he snapped at one point. "I've been on the force for 10 years. I know how to do my job." "And yet," Carter replied evenly, "your actions today suggest otherwise. There are protocols for situations like this, and you didn't follow them. That's a serious issue, Officer Reynolds." Rachel watched from a distance, her stomach churning with a mix of vindication and dread. She wanted justice, But she also knew how these things could go. She'd read too many stories, seen too many headlines about situations like this ending with no accountability. The system didn't always work the way it should. As the minutes ticked by, the atmosphere remained charged. More officers arrived, some clearly there to provide oversight, others perhaps just drawn by the escalating drama. The lot had become a makeshift stage, with everyone playing their part in a story that felt far bigger than any of them. Rachel's phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She pulled it out and saw a text from her best friend, Kara. Asterisk, where are you? Everything okay? Asterisk. She hesitated before replying, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed. Asterisk, long story. I'll explain later, asterisk. When she looked up, she saw that Carter had finished speaking with Reynolds and was now addressing the other officers. From her gestures and tone, it was clear that she was laying out a plan, though Rachel couldn't hear the specifics. She felt a pang of frustration, of wanting to know what was happening, of wanting some reassurance that this nightmare would finally end. But deep down she knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The wheels of justice, if they turned at all, would turn slowly, and for now, all she could do was wait. The tension in the parking lot had reached a breaking point. Rachel could feel the weight of every passing second, the air charged with a sense of inevitability. She leaned against her truck, arms crossed, trying to steady her breathing. Every conversation happening among the officers seemed just out of reach, their words muted by the distance and the pounding of her heart. Sergeant Carter walked back toward her, her expression carefully neutral. Rachel couldn't read her, and the uncertainty gnawed at her insides. The security guard, who had stayed close by, gave her a slight nod, as if to silently remind her that she wasn't alone in this. But even his presence couldn't ease the knot in her stomach. "We're escalating this," Carter said when she reached Rachel. Her voice was calm, but there was a seriousness in her tone that made Rachel's skin prickle. "Internal Affairs has been contacted. They'll review the footage and conduct a formal investigation." Rachel blinked, unsure how to respond. What does that mean? Is he just going to walk away for now? Carter's jaw tightened. For the moment, Officer Reynolds is being placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. He won't be patrolling the streets. But I need you to understand that these processes take time. It's important to let the system work. Rachel let out a shaky breath, her fists clenching at her sides. And what if the system doesn't work? What if he just gets a slap on the wrist? Carter met her gaze, her eyes softening just slightly. That's why your voice and this video evidence are so important. You've taken the first step. Now we need to follow through. Nearby, Reynolds stood with another officer, his face set in a mask of anger and defiance. He was speaking in low, sharp tones, but Rachel could catch enough to know he wasn't taking this quietly. "This is ridiculous," he hissed. "You're throwing me under the bus over some random woman's word. This is how we treat our own now." The officer with him didn't respond, his posture stiff and uncomfortable. It was clear he didn't want to get involved. Reynolds' frustration only grew, his voice rising enough to draw the attention of everyone around him. "Unbelievable," he muttered, shaking his head. "You're all spineless." Rachel flinched at the words, but Carter didn't miss a beat. She stepped forward, her presence commanding as she addressed Reynolds directly. "Officer Reynolds, I suggest you keep your comments professional. Anything you say right now will be documented." Reynolds glared at her, but didn't respond. His jaw worked as if he were biting back more words, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Rachel couldn't help but notice the contrast between his demeanor and Carter's calm authority. For a moment, it almost felt like justice might be possible. But then doubt crept back in. She'd seen too many stories where the evidence was clear, the witnesses credible, and still nothing happened. The thought of going through all of this, reliving the fear, the humiliation, the anger, only to see him walk away scot-free was almost too much to bear. As Carter and the other officers worked to wrap up the immediate situation, Rachel's phone buzzed again. It was Kara, calling this time. She hesitated before answering, her voice shaky as she said, "Hey, Rachel." Kara's voice was filled with worry. "I've been trying to reach you. What's going on? Are you okay?" Rachel hesitated, glancing around the chaotic scene. I'm okay," she said finally. "It's just been a really long day." Kara's tone softened. "Do you want me to come to you? Whatever it is, you don't have to go through it alone." The offer brought tears to Rachel's eyes, but she shook her head, even though Kara couldn't see her. "I appreciate it," she said, "but I think I need to handle this myself for now. I'll explain everything later, I promise." "Okay," Kara said reluctantly, "but if you need me, I'm here, anytime." Rachel ended the call and slipped her phone back into her pocket, her resolve hardening. She wasn't sure what the next steps would look like, but she knew she couldn't back down. Not now, not after everything she'd already endured. The scene began to clear out as additional officers arrived to handle the administrative aspects of the situation. Reynolds was escorted to his patrol car, his face dark with barely contained rage. Rachel watched as he was driven away, a strange mix of relief and unease washing over her. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. Sergeant Carter approached her again, her expression softer this time. "You've been through a lot today," she said, "but I want you to know that your bravery in standing up for yourself is what's going to make the difference here. This kind of behavior doesn't go unchecked. Not anymore." Rachel nodded, though her heart still felt heavy. "I just want to believe that's true," she said quietly. "It is," Carter assured her, "but I know it's hard to have faith in the process. If you have any questions, or if you need support, don't hesitate to reach out. You're not alone in this." The words were meant to be comforting, and to some extent they were. But as Rachel climbed into her truck and drove away from the parking lot, she couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was yet to come. The fight wasn't over, it was just beginning. And as much as she wanted to believe in justice, the uncertainty loomed over her like a shadow, refusing to let her rest. Rachel spent the night replaying everything in her mind. Every word, every look, every sound from the parking lot seemed etched into her memory. Sleep eluded her, her thoughts racing as the weight of what had happened settled in. She had taken the first step, yes, but the uncertainty of what lay ahead was suffocating. Would justice really prevail? Or was she just setting herself up for another disappointment? The next morning, Rachel decided to take a drive to clear her head. The town was still waking up, the streets quiet except for the occasional car or early riser out for a jog. She turned onto the main road, her mind wandering to what Sergeant Carter had said about the investigation. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to hope that the system might actually work this time. A phone buzzed on the seat beside her, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen and saw an unknown number. Hesitating for a moment, she picked up. "Hello." The voice on the other end was low and unfamiliar. "Rachel." "Yes, this is Rachel." "Who is this?" she asked cautiously. It's Pete." "I'm an officer." "Well, I was. I used to work with Reynolds." Rachel's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Why are you calling me?" Pete hesitated, his voice dropping to a whisper, as though he didn't want to be overheard. "Listen, I heard about what happened yesterday, and I thought you should know something. Reynolds, he's got connections, friends in places that make this kind of thing disappear." Rachel's stomach sank. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you need to be careful," Pete warned. "People like him, they don't play fair. They'll do whatever it takes to protect themselves, even if that means turning this around on you." The line went silent for a moment as Rachel processed his words. Her heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing with questions. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I've seen it happen before," Pete admitted. Good people getting crushed because they thought the truth was enough. I couldn't live with myself if I stayed quiet. Rachel swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she asked, "What should I do?" Pete's tone softened. "Stay alert. Document everything. And whatever you do, don't let them intimidate you. They'll try, but you have more power than you think." Before Rachel could respond, The line went dead. She stared at her phone, her mind spinning. What did Pete mean by connections? Was he exaggerating, or was this a real threat? The warning only added to the storm of emotions she was already feeling: fear, anger, determination. As the day wore on, Rachel decided she couldn't just sit around and wait for something to happen. She reached out to a local community organization that advocated for police accountability, sharing her story and the video she had recorded. The woman she spoke with, a calm and confident activist named Nina, assured her that she wasn't alone. "This isn't the first time we've dealt with something like this," Nina said. "The system can be slow, but with enough public pressure, we can make sure they can't sweep this under the rug." Rachel felt a flicker of hope as Nina explained their strategy, organizing a community meeting, reaching out to local media, and rallying support online. For the first time, it felt like there was a plan, a way to fight back. But just as Rachel started to feel like she was gaining control, another blow came out of nowhere. That evening, she received an email from an anonymous sender. The subject line read, "Drop it." The message was short and chilling. "You think you're doing the right thing, but you don't know who you're messing with. Stop now, or you'll regret it." Rachel's hands shook as she read the words. The email felt like a punch to the gut, a stark reminder of how dangerous this fight could be. She forwarded it to Nina immediately, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. "That's a clear intimidation tactic," Nina said firmly when they spoke on the phone. "But it also shows they're scared. They know you have the power to expose them. We'll report this to the authorities and make sure it's documented." Rachel nodded that her anxiety was mounting. The stakes were higher than ever, and the fight was becoming more personal with each passing moment. She knew she couldn't back down, but the pressure was almost unbearable. Later that night, as Rachel sat in her dimly lit apartment, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Kara. "Saw something weird. Call me ASAP." Rachel dialed her friend's number, her heart pounding. "What's going on?" she asked as soon as Kara picked up. "I don't know if it's connected, but there's a guy parked near your place," Kara said, her voice laced with concern. "I noticed him when I drove by earlier. He's just sitting there watching." Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. "Are you sure? What does he look like?" "I couldn't see much, but the car has tinted windows," Kara said. "It didn't feel right, Rach. You need to be careful." Rachel peeked out her window, her pulse racing. Sure enough, there was a dark car parked on the street, its engine idling. She couldn't see inside. The sight of it sent her heart into overdrive. Was this related to the email? To Reynolds? Or was she just being paranoid? She quickly closed the curtains, her mind spinning with possibilities. The fight for justice had turned into something far more dangerous than she'd anticipated. And as much as she wanted to believe she was strong enough to handle it, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was in over her head. But one thing was certain. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about standing up for everyone who had ever been silenced, everyone who had ever felt powerless. And no matter how high the stakes got, Rachel knew she couldn't give up now. The fight was far from over, and the most intense battles were still to come. Rachel's heart pounded as she paced her apartment. The shadows of the drawn curtains seemed to stretch across the room, pressing in on her. The car outside hadn't moved, and Kara's warning echoed in her mind. She knew she couldn't let fear paralyze her, but the weight of everything was beginning to feel unbearable.
Stay put.
Nina
replied
replied quickly.
it was
Time to take action.
I'll send someone
Grabbing
over
her
to
phone,
check it out,
she called Nina.
Don't go outside alone.
"I think someone's watching
As
my
Rachel
place."
hung up,
Rachel
her
said,
resolve hardened.
her voice trembling
She
despite
wasn't
her
going to
effort
let them
sound
intimidate her
calm.
into silence.
She began sifting through the evidence she had collected, organizing her notes, timestamps, and the video clips she'd saved. She knew the truth was her greatest weapon, and she was determined to wield it with precision. Minutes felt like hours until Nina's contact arrived. It was a young man named Jamal, a local activist who worked closely with Nina. He parked down the street, careful not to draw attention, and knocked softly on Rachel's door. "You okay?" Jamal asked as she let him in. Rachel nodded, though her eyes darted nervously toward the window. That car's been out there for hours. Journal peeked through the curtains, his expression serious. We'll handle this. But first, let's make sure you're safe. They worked together to secure Rachel's apartment, locking windows and setting up a camera near the door. Jamal promised to stay nearby, his presence a small comfort in the chaos. Still, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The next morning brought a surprising turn of events. Nina called with news that a local journalist had picked up Rachel's story and wanted to feature it on their evening broadcast. It was a chance to bring everything into the open, to let the world see what had happened. Rachel hesitated for a moment, the thought of putting herself in the spotlight both terrifying and exhilarating. I'll do it, she said finally. If this is how we hold them accountable, I'm in. That evening, Rachel sat under the harsh lights of the news studio, her palms damp with nerves. The reporter, a seasoned journalist named Claire, guided her through the interview. Rachel recounted the events with a mix of composure and raw emotion, her voice steady even as she relived the fear and humiliation of that night. As the interview aired, Rachel's phone began buzzing with messages of support. Strangers from across the city and beyond reached out, sharing their own stories and offering encouragement. The tide was turning, and for the first time, it felt like the truth was winning. But just as Rachel began to feel a sense of relief, the unexpected happened. Late that night, there was a knock at her door. She froze, her mind racing. Who would come to her place at this hour? Peering through the peephole, she saw Sergeant Carter standing outside, his face unreadable. Her stomach twisted as she opened the door cautiously. Rachel, he said, his voice low. I needed to talk to you. What is it? She asked warily. I wanted to let you know that Reynolds has been suspended pending further investigation, Carter said, his tone measured. But there's something else you need to know. Rachel's pulse quickened. What is it? Carter hesitated, his gaze dropping for a moment. Reynolds isn't acting alone. There's a bigger network at play here, people who have been covering for each other for years. This goes beyond one officer, and if you keep pushing, you're going to be stepping on some powerful toes. Rachel stared at him, her mind reeling. Why are you telling me this? Because you're brave, Carter said simply. And because people like you are the only ones who can break this cycle. Just watch your back. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Rachel standing in the doorway, her thoughts a whirlwind. His words confirmed her worst fears, but also fueled her determination. This wasn't just about her story. It was about changing a system that had allowed people like Reynolds to thrive unchecked. In the days that followed, the investigation gained momentum. Rachel's video and testimony had sparked outrage, and public pressure forced the department to take action. As more officers came forward with their own accounts of corruption, the web of lies and cover-ups began to unravel. But the final twist came when Rachel received an anonymous package in the mail. Inside was a USB drive containing footage from a hidden camera in Reynolds' patrol car. The video showed not only the events of that night, but also conversations revealing his involvement in other abuses of power. The evidence was damning, and it was the missing piece that sealed his fate. Rachel handed the footage over to the authorities, and within weeks, Reynolds was formally charged. The network he had relied on crumbled as more people came forward, emboldened by Rachel's courage. As she watched the news report detailing the fallout, Rachel felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. The fight had taken everything she had, but it was worth it. Justice, though imperfect and delayed, had finally been served. But even as the credits rolled on this chapter of her life, Rachel knew her work wasn't done. There were still voices to amplify, systems to challenge, and stories to tell. And she was ready to keep fighting, for herself, for her community, and for a world where everyone could stand tall without fear.